In the last few years, a lot of Pokémon development info has been leaked from Game Freak's internal servers. First, there was a big leak in 2020 and another even larger one followed in 2024, one that generated so many headlines I doubt you missed it. But while most of the focus was understandably so on cut Pokémon or maybe the newfound lore of Sinnoh, as I talked about myself, another very interesting element of it that I've seen very little people discuss is the story or plot that Ruby and Sapphire were supposed to have during development. It is completely different from what we ended up getting, an early version of it essentially. That also means it is incredibly interesting to go through these leaked design documents, plans and even localization files that show us a glimpse into what Ruby and Sapphire also could have been. I've tried to collect all this information and turn it into a chronological story the games might have told had this beta story been the final one for Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. Or should I say Pokémon Indigo and Vermilion. It feels hard to believe, seeing as both those colors are already used for locations in Kanto, but there is evidence to suggest that once upon a time, very early in development, these were meant to be Ruby and Sapphire's names. The games are referred to as Indigo and Vermilion in the comments for the script files of Route 102, which is the first route to have version exclusives and therefore needs to have the game's titles listed. It seems to originate from very early in development though, as it seems likely Game Freak started working on the routes in chronological order, meaning Route 102 was very early in development. But alright, that was just to give you an idea of the kind of development tales these leaks allow us to find. We won't be relying much on route data though going forward. Instead, the vast majority of our information is courtesy of several character profiles that have been unearthed here. You may remember from the leak some reports about how Skyla, from Black and White, was meant to be a, I quote, sexy Latina pilot based on Jennifer Lopez, which received quite some attention, obviously. Well, Gen 3 has these same kinds of profiles too, and from a Pokemon lore standpoint, they contain a lot more interesting information than Skyla's profile ever did. Let's start with our player character, who at the time was not yet named. It is worth pointing out though that the male and female protagonists have slightly different profiles. There's a lot of overlap, obviously. For example, they both have the trait of looking up to their father, who's a gym leader, but there are also other details that seem to specifically apply to when their character would serve as a rival only. For example, May has listed that she has a catchphrase, which is yeah, something that wouldn't survive into the final game, but also would make no sense for a silent protagonist to have. The ages of Brandon and May are revealed here to be 12, which was never mentioned at the time and didn't resurface until Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. The same can be said actually for every age listed in these profiles. All of them went effectively unknown at the time, but most became public knowledge when ORAS released. Compared to May, Brandon is way more of a clean slate. All that's listed in his profile beyond what we see happen in the final game is that he's good with his hands, likes to ride bikes, is interested in so many things that he's prone to clumsy mistakes, and that because he is so generous he can be a busybody. All these character traits are repeated in May's profile verbatim, but there are a few things unique to her added. For example, it is stated that while May is an active, sporty girl, she is not a tomboy. She believes femininity has its advantages. She likes video games and often participates in tournaments and wears glasses when reading books, which is a design element that has never reappeared, interestingly enough. While there were no names decided for Brandon and May at the time, that would of course eventually happen, and we also have some insight into how these English names came to be. For May, the names Maggie, Terra and Georgie were considered, but were all scrapped because they sounded like they associated the character with Team Magma. Similarly, Brandon had beta names like Winslow, Flynn and Skylar, all of which were scrapped because they relate to flying and that would make him sound like he was specifically associated with that type. However, it also mentioned that Brandon's final name comes from breeze, as in a fresh new breeze, befitting of the new start that Ruby and Sapphire were meant to feel like. May's name obviously comes from the month and is also specifically stated to sound refreshing and pleasant. But okay, so we have our main characters, time to start our beta adventure. Even early on, the protagonists were also meant to move to Hoenn alongside their family, the father of which is of course a gym leader here. They move into what the final game calls Little Root Town, but during development the names Rootborn Town and Lucy Town were also suggested. The mother of the player characters is stated in her profile to be 32 years old, and someone who admires her husband very much. Cooking is her main talent, and she's specified to be intelligent, although unlike Norman, never at any point was she meant to have a name. Another Little Root Town resident is Professor Birch, although his profile mentions he is always at work at the lab, so he's rarely home. They survived to the final game, as did his tendency to prefer to study out in nature, but information that has never been revealed but was planned is that at one point in the past, Birch was Norman's junior student during their university days. It is also not mentioned here that Brendan or May are his child, suggesting that at this point in time, the opposite protagonist may not have appeared in the game yet. It is unknown whether the setup with the starter and Birch being attacked by a Pucciana was always meant to be part of the game, but personally, I think the inclusion that Birch prefers field studies to be a certain hint at that. Since the early game is very light on story and characters, we continue on to Oldale Town, which too had several potential names go unused. There was Abaldera Town, Fintwig Town, Roseburg Town, Pastora, which would have made Oldale Town the first settlement in Pokemon history without a town or city suffix, as well as, very interestingly, Petalburg Town, which obviously didn't happen, as Petalburg City is the next place we visit. It could have also been called Halcyon City, Still Dawn City, Sunbank City, or Sunshore City, which obviously resembles a name we would end up getting a generation later. But okay, this is where the story starts to pick up a little, as we meet Wally, and man, Wally used to be really different. You see, this development info predates the creation of the God of War line, meaning that Wally had an entirely different ace and story to him. Rather than catching a Ralts as his first Pokemon, he was originally meant to catch a Ponyta. It is possible this was a placeholder, as a main rival of a new region not using a new Pokemon feels very odd, especially one that isn't even in the Hoenn dex in the final game. But seeing as Ponyta was baked into his character as well, that doesn't feel likely. From the very get-go, Wally was described and meant to be sickly and physically frail. In fact, the localizers suggested his name be Gilbert, as, in their words, that name would make Americans understand that he is weak. Sorry to all you Gilberts watching. His dream is to use this Ponyta to run and play in the hills and fields after he has recovered, and it is mentioned that after catching Ponyta, Wally will gradually improve and feel stronger. This is also why he was designed to be cute in his own sickly way, that's a quote, rather than too delicate. At one point, he would become a serious threat. But first, he was moving from Petalburg to Verdanturf Town for the improved air, which was actually kept in the final game as well. We will talk more about Wally's journey later, when it returns in the story, but first we continue our track to Route 104, where we meet Mr. Briny. Based on what we can tell, not a whole lot was changed about this elderly sailor, although it is worth pointing out that the documents refer to Pico, his Wingull, solely as bird Pokemon. It is likely this is because Wingle's name hadn't been decided yet, but it is also possible that Pico, as in Mr. Briny's bird buddy, preceded the creation of Wingull the species, but this is speculation on my part. We continue on towards Petalburg Woods, which are actually only called Petalburg Woods because Petalburg Forest was too long, and end up in Rustboro City, one of the only places in Hoenn that didn't have any prior names. They came up with Rustboro and knew it was a hit, apparently. The character profile for Roxanne, the first gym leader, only shows her concept of a prodigy at the trainer school was decided very early on, because really, the profile used here still applies perfectly to the final game. But that can definitely not be said for the Devon Corporation, also found in Rustboro. In the final game, the Devon Corporation is not super important, but it's definitely story relevant, allowing you to meet Stephen Stone early through his father Mr. Stone. Originally, the Devon Corporation was supposed to be much more impactful though, and tied directly into the main villains of the game, Team Magma and Aqua, who are by far the element most changed from these early drafts to the final game. We're gonna let go of chronological order here a little to detail how exactly Team Magma and Aqua were supposed to work. First of all, their names were different. Team Magma was Team Tunnel and Team Aqua was Team Marine. There is evidence to suggest these names were actually placeholders and never meant to be final, but I still think it's worth mentioning. Like I said, the Devon Corporation was meant to tie into their story. The company was supposed to be run by President Mr. Joseph, who is a beta version of Mr. Stone. Mr. Stone's final first name actually is Joseph, so that shows the connection right then and there. There was no love for stones yet though. Mr. Joseph's passion wasn't minerals, it was water-type Pokemon, and specifically how they evolve. Devon also didn't have anything to do with mining or whatever like in the final game, but instead developed medicine, with the company developing forms of medicine that helped Pokemon evolve, something that was completely scrapped, although it does remind me a tiny bit of what happened with Feebas in the final game. While Mr. Joseph apparently wasn't meant to be evil himself, his profile does suggest that is what the player is supposed to suspect, and he's at the very least described as a shady businessman of sorts. But the real villain hailing from Devon would be Chief UNUSED, who is the leader of Devon's medical department. This is however just a ruse. In reality, he is the leader of the evil Team Tunnel, making him effectively Maxie's prototype. He manages to convince Mr. Joseph to give him financial backing to create and run his team, and in return is slowly filling up Devon with his own subordinates, supposedly to eventually overthrow Mr. Joseph and control the company. Not only is this a completely different goal from the final Team Magma, Groudon isn't even mentioned here, it is also hard to imagine how Team Aqua could ever be a counterpart to this story. But trust me, it was. Team Marine may have had a completely different story that had nothing to do with Devon whatsoever, but it is tied into what Team Tunnel was doing in a direct parallel. Team Marine was run by Captain Stern, which is a name that might sound familiar because Stern is actually a character in the final game as well, running his own shipyard and the Oceanic Museum in Slateport City. From this early development to the final game, there was a bit of a naming carousel though. Originally, there were 3 characters involved with this. You had Captain Stern, leader of Team Marine, Captain Doc, who was the person running the shipyard, and Director Maxie, the director of the Oceanic Museum. What the role of the latter two was is not entirely clear, but it seems both were involved in a subplot where the player needed to bring Mr. Briny to them to help develop and sail a newly developed ship. This was obviously scrapped, with the character of Captain Doc instead being given an extremely minor role. The roles of shipyard owner and museum director were to be shared now, and the names of Archie and Stern were swapped. But okay, originally that wasn't the case, and Stern was the leader of the evil team. Although, evil? Team Marine's entire thing was defending Pokemon from Team Tunnel, which doesn't sound that evil to be honest. And that is exactly what the parallel was supposed to be. Team Tunnel and their leader Chief UNUSED were posing to be good guys, but were actually evil, whereas everyone would think Team Marine was evil because they were kidnapping Pokemon from Team Tunnel, but they were actually saving them, and Captain Stern was a good guy who was regarded by everyone as a pirate. It is a very interesting contrast between the two that didn't survive to the final game, but would have been very cool to see. Eventually, it was Captain Stern's plan to free the Pokemon he had collected from Team Tunnel using a rocket from Mauville City, which I don't really get how that's supposed to work, but oh well. It's good to know the space station was meant to tie into something at least. He also had a group of 12 generals following him loyally, which not a lot is known about, but it seems to be the precursor of the admins we got in the final game. And here's the final kicker. Originally, Captain Stern was Sootopolis City's water gym leader. Not Wallace, not One, it was originally Captain Stern. But over time, as you know, this idea of Team Aqua and Magma was completely cut from the game and replaced with a plot revolving around Groudon and Kyogre. Stern became Archie and Archie became Stern, and UNUSED eventually became Maxie. At first, he was slated to use this sprite rather than the final one, which honestly looks better than the final one. Okay, now you might be wondering, if Mr. Stone was not supposed to be all about stones, how does that impact Steven Stone, his son? Well, the thing is, it doesn't really. Steven is still mentioned to be champion, still into rare stones, set to run into the player in locations where they can be found, and although his last name isn't stated here yet, seeing as Mr. Joseph also doesn't have a last name, it is specifically mentioned Devon is still run by his father. But there is one interesting difference. His father doesn't know he is the champion, because he ran away to train when he was only 19 years old. It's a little reminiscent of Silver and Giovanni in a way, isn't it? Anyway, now that we have discussed the brunt of the evil team story arc, let's continue focusing on the league path, so to speak, which brings us to Jewfer Town, or how it was at one point considered to be called Jewel Town, a pun on Jew and Jewel, referring of course to the fighting gym courtesy of Brawly. Just like Roxanne, Brawly didn't change much, although his profile does portray him as a little more vain, as someone who doesn't want to bulk too much out of fear of ruining his body. As we move on to Slayport City, early on named as Slaytropic City, we would of course run into the aforementioned Director Archie and Captain Doc, before then continuing towards Mauville City. Interestingly enough, very early on in development, it was already planned for Watson to be the person behind the electrification of New Mauville, plans he abandoned out of fear it would harm the Pokémon. If I remember correctly, this is barely mentioned in Ruby and Sapphire and instead mostly revealed in ORAS, but it was actually part of his character from the very early days. Mauville City was supposed to have even more important characters though. In the final game, the bike shop is to be found here and plays a minor role, but originally its role was much bigger. The boss of the shop, Mr. Rydell, is given his own profile, revealing he is 65 years old and is a slim older man with a white beard. He's an expert old-fashioned bikesmith, who just can't get enough of them and has a great passion for customizing them, which obviously ties into the whole Acro and Mac bike concept. He also had two employees that were completely cut from the final game, being Satoru and Pedro. Satoru is a young Asian man, an intellectual who is good at strength calculations, while Pedro is a Westerner who takes pride in handiness. Based on this, I speculate the original idea may have been that Satoru gave you access to the Mac bike, while Pedro did the same for the Acro bike. At the end though, the characterization of Rydell's bike shop was severely toned down, and Satoru and Pedro weren't the only cut characters either. There was also Pakura, a 24-year-old wandering meteorite hunter who would travel Hoenn looking for star pieces and sell them to the player. His physical description actually matches very closely with Arun, a character introduced in ORAS, potentially suggesting Pakura served as inspiration for his creation, even if their purposes are different. It is worth pointing out though that there is evidence to suggest star pieces were meant to be more important in the original draft. You see, Professor Cosmo, who in the final game lives in Falarbor Town and specializes in meteorite excavations at Meteor Falls, was supposed to live in Mauville City, where he would trade the player Pokemon for star pieces. It is mentioned in his character profile that he doesn't really care for Pokemon, seemingly making his motivation the idea that he instead prefers rocks, thus making this a worthwhile trade. But okay, back to the journey, which brings us to Verdanturf Town, which was actually at one point slated to be called Fortree Town before it was decided that suited the Wooded City better. Also worth pointing out is that a beta map of Rusturf Tunnel shows it with a more intricate design, suggesting that the story arc of that location was actually not meant to happen, with the player themselves venturing through Rusturf as if it was a small dungeon. Next up, Lava Ridge Town and its gym leader Flannery. While her final Japanese name is Asuna, she is referred to as Ayame at this point in time. Her profile itself matches her final depiction quite closely though, so I suggest we don't waste time and continue with Norman, who was actually barely fleshed out at this point in time. We know he's your father, we know he uses normal types, and that's about it. He didn't even have a name yet and was merely referred to as Dad. It is worth pointing out though that his English name doesn't just come from the word normal. The suffix man was specifically chosen so he would feel like an adult. We continue en route to Fortree City, which was originally called Witherwood City back when Verdanturf was still Fortree. It was however always meant to be a city of tree houses, as they are mentioned even in Winona's earliest profile. It is explained she is an instructor of sorts for the people of the city, teaching them how to coexist with Pokemon. She has a natural ability to see air currents, which she uses to instruct her own Pokemon, and this has even made her come across as a little arrogant, even if she doesn't mean to. All of this information apparently didn't survive to the final game, it's at least not mentioned anywhere. Just like the idea that her outfit is meant to be nice and warm when riding atop of her bird Pokemon. Her age is also listed here as only 16, which I didn't really picture, nor has this age ever been made canon in say ORAS later on. We now get into the late game of Ruby and Sapphire, and this is where things get a little more muddy. After all, these profiles focus more on the basics of the characters rather than the actual story, and as such, not a lot is known about the climax of it. However, we do know Mossdeep City is still the next gym we're supposed to visit, but don't expect to find Tate and Liza there. They don't exist yet. Instead, Wally is the gym leader of Mauville City. And weirdly enough, although, like I said, the God of War line doesn't exist yet and Ponyta was his starting ace in this game, he is listed as a psychic type gym leader. How that could have worked, I have no clue, but it seems likely, in hindsight at least, that the God of War line was actually created specifically for Wally to be his psychic type ace, rather than the other way around. Not a whole lot more is known about Wally's potential team or role as a gym leader, but it is obvious that while his story from sickly weakling to powerful trainer was always planned, the climax was supposed to happen much earlier than Victory Road. And speaking of climax, this is more or less where it is supposed to happen in the game, right? In between Gym 7 and 8? Well, like I said, there is not a whole lot known about what the climactic end of the beta story was supposed to be, but we do know it exists. Elite 4 member Drake's character profile mentions that in the beta story he had a role in the plot, which he doesn't have in the final game. Alongside Steven, he was supposed to evacuate the people of Sootopolis City when Groudon or Kyogre awaken, revealing that around this time, the legendary Pokémon were planned to play a role in the climax of the story, although they weren't tied into the evil teams much, from what we can tell. But now that we're in Sootopolis, let's talk about it. Other names considered for this place were Sootopolis City and Sootopolis City, but both were rejected because they didn't feel elegant enough, which is why the Opolis was added. It sounds more luxurious. And while I said that at one point Captain Stern was supposed to be gym leader here, it does appear as if he was replaced quite early on, because Wallace shows up very early in the design documents too. It is noteworthy though that he is mentioned as both a water and ice gym leader depending on where you look, so maybe that was yet to be decided at this time. His name also was not final at this point, it literally says temporary next to it, despite it ending up being kept. I also think it's funny to know that the localization team considered calling him Walt or Walton, but decided against it because, I quote, "these names don't sound elegant." And that leaves us with the final stretch of the game, the journey across water towards Evergrande City and the Pokemon League. I do want to mention something I found very cool regarding Pacific Log Town though. We see in their notes that the localization team was adamant to have the word gold incorporated into the town's name, but struggled to make it work. Goldenbrook Town was deemed too similar to Goldenrod City, and Ocean Town and Auckland Town, which incorporate AU, the element symbol for gold, were considered too difficult for kids to understand. So the team decided to reverse the word, which is how we ended up with Pacific Log Town, with the last 4 letters being gold reversed. Very cool. But okay, time for the Pokemon League and especially the members of the Elite Four. Really the only characters we have still to cover. First up is Sydney, who actually has baked into his profile that he is the first. According to this text, he doesn't care he's first. He just wants to have fun in battles, and as the first member, you get the most battles. His age is listed as 27, but it is specified his age is supposed to be impossible to tell, which I wouldn't say it is in the final game, but I could see that being the inspiration behind his design. His lack of hair does make him look older than 27, I would say. Next is Phoebe, who is actually a very interesting case because her profile directly references the real world. The festival known as Gosan no Ukuribi, or just Ukuribi for short, is mentioned as an inspiration for her. It is fitting, seeing as the festival is about sending the spirits of lost family members back to the spirit world, but it is very noteworthy that the profile talks about this festival as if it exists in Hoenn as well, detailing she's related to an old woman involved in it. This clearly ties into Mount Pyre, which is what Phoebe is associated with in the final game, so this shows us a very early look at what Mount Pyre might have been planned to be like, being more festive and symbolic than it is in the final game. Then we have Glacia, who is noted in her profile to not be a Hoenn native, instead hailing from a cold country. The final games do mention she isn't from Hoenn, but never specify anything about her origin region, meaning this design document is an exclusive look at that. It's also mentioned that Glacia trained in Sootopolis City to hone her skills, because Sootopolis is warm, and therefore a tricky environment for her ice types. However, it is also possible it is meant to tie into Sootopolis City potentially having an ice type gym, but that is speculation on my part. And then we still have Drake, who I already covered most of the interesting stuff about, but it's worth pointing out that this profile mentions his appearance as being dark-skinned with a beard, which isn't how he looks in the final game. Drake is white and has a mustache, no beard. And finally we have Steven, and although I did tackle most of what can be said about him, there is one thing I purposefully left out to discuss right now. Two of the proposed names for Steven were Espen and Manuel, and that is noteworthy. You see, Espen is very close to the Japanese word for psychic, Esper, whereas Manuel comes from mana, meaning mysterious power. Both of these names could be seen as a hint that at one point Steven was meant to be a psychic specialist, which would still fit Metagross of course. This could potentially have been around the time Wally was cut as a gym leader, but before Tate and Liza were created, so when there wasn't a psychic gym leader already in place. Another hint at this is the fact that his profile doesn't list Steel as his focus type, instead saying Steven is a psychic / steel specialist. So who knows, maybe at one point he was supposed to be less steel coded. But yeah, that has been the entire beta plot of Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. Or Indigo and Vermilion, as they are still occasionally referred to in these profiles. What change surprised you the most? And what did you wish was kept? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Pokémon content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.